Star Wars Jedi Survivor has put me in an uncomfortable position. As a Star Wars fan, I personally loved and enjoyed this game, and it is, in my opinion, Game of the Year contender. But on the other hand, the game is marred by performance issues. Now, I want to be clear. For my own personal experience, the only issues I had was with regards to the game's overall frame rate. I did experience one crash. I did experience one bug. But aside from that, the main issue was with performance. Now, the performance of the game was not disruptive to my gameplay experience to the point where it hindered my enjoyment. Essentially, the frame rate given my rig stayed above 35 frames per second while using 70% GPU utilization for the opening planet of Coruscant. That planet was the worst of my performance issues that I experienced through my playthrough. Once I had surpassed that planet and got on to the next planet, my frame rate would jump to 60 to 70 frames per second while using 100% GPU utilization. So without question, the game is unoptimized, and any attempt to adjust my settings barely did anything to the frame rate with the exception of turning off ray tracing, which would give me an additional 10 frames per second. But after I passed that first initial planet and played the game at 35 frames per second, the frame rate got better and never dipped below 50 FPS from that point onward. From that point onward, I was always minimum 50 and as much as 70 on average, which is not a terrible experience. And as someone who comes from the era of all the way back down to 8-bit, and I played a lot of N64 titles, GoldenEye 4-player had frame rate drops, Perfect Dark had frame rate drops. What I experienced in this game was minuscule. It didn't really bother me. And the frame rate stutters that people have alluded to on the PC version, if they were present, I didn't notice them. So from my own personal experience, the game ran for the most part fine, other than that first planet. And playing a game at 35 frames per second, it's not bad. 30 frames is not bad. I think people are blowing that out of proportion. However, I do recognize that there are other people out there who had a terrible experience where the game would just crash and they couldn't play it. They would lose a save file. There was all sorts of issues. I've seen videos of people with a 3070 having 20 frames per second. So while my experience was good, and I know some people share that experience, others, it was not. And then, of course, you have the console players. My brother played on an Xbox Series X. He didn't have any issues, but he played it in graphics mode, which, to my understanding, the graphics mode, the game is very much playable. It is the performance mode on those consoles that suffers, much in the same way that the PC version suffers from trying to go above the 30 frames per second. So, aside from that, which was the biggest issue with the game, I think in terms of content, Jedi Survivor was flawless. It was everything I wanted as a Star Wars fan. Jedi Fallen Order, everything about it had been improved. They added fast travel so you wouldn't have to backtrack as much. The skill tier system, you now have a very deep skill tier system, right? There are 5 different fighting styles to choose from. You can only have 2 equipped at any given time, but you had 5 to choose from. They all play differently, and they all have their own skill trees. Plus, you have your 4 skill trees, and then you have your overall general survival skill tree. So there's a lot of depth that was added to the game. Obviously, this game is absolutely gorgeous. And the story for this game is fantastic. I love the fact that they managed to tell an original story set in this time period without handcuffing themselves by including major characters from the actual canon that could complicate matters down the road. They did a very good job. I could not stop playing this game. Everything. The combat was tight. The graphics are amazing. The audio is good. The characters, the story, the writing, the acting. Everything about this game I was in love with. I adored this game. This game, to me, is a Game of the Year contender, especially as a Star Wars fan. If you are not a Star Wars fan, this is still a great game to experience, barring the performance issues. This is what makes this review so complicated for me, because how do I recommend a game where the content and the substance is there, but your experience and due to the performance may not be? So the way I see it when it comes to this particular game is, if you're going to play this game on console, I would recommend playing it on the graphics mode until they had fixed the issues of performance mode. If you must play it in 60 frames per second, then I would recommend that you wait for this game to get fixed. If you are on PC and you have my specifications or similar to it, you should have, in theory, a similar experience. However, if you do not have my specs, then you may need to really consider whether or not this is worth trying out. If you have EA Play, or you're a Game Pass subscriber that has EA Play included, I would recommend trying the game out. Use the 10-hour trial and see how it runs on your rig, and if you're satisfied with it, continue on. If you're not satisfied with it, then you didn't spend anything. Or alternatively, you could purchase the game on Steam, play within the 2-hour time limit, and get your money back if it's not to your satisfaction. So this is why when I watched other people's reviews like SkillUp's, and I could hear the heartbreak in his voice, because Jedi Survivor, once you get past those performance issues, this is unquestionably a Game of the Year contender, especially if you're a Star Wars fan like myself. I absolutely adore this game. I couldn't stop playing it. Even when I wasn't playing it, all I could think about was playing it. This game had me hooked. But at the same time, my personal experience, I had a good experience. The game wasn't perfect in terms of performance, but it was still good. And that's the key cog here, is the performance is the underlying issue with this game. So if I'm going to go based on my experience with Jedi Survivor, the way I'm going to review this game based on my experience, but to be fair to those who do not have this identical rig or may not have a similar experience, I will give Jedi Survivor a 9.5 out of 10 with an asterisk. And the asterisk being, this is contingent on the game actually running the way it's supposed to run. And that how it is going to run will vary from person to person. And there's no other way to put it. I've spoken to people who have a great time. My brother's loving it on the Xbox. I loved it. And I know a few other people who loved it. On the flip side, I do know people who had issues with it. But that issues is, it's really going to be on a case-by-case basis. This is very similar to Cyberpunk 2077 when that launched. How some people, if they had the appropriate PC, they had a good time. But to me, performance issues aside, that was the only issue I had with this game. If the performance of this game ran appropriately, this would be a 10 out of 10 game for me. But I'm also a Star Wars nerd, so there is some Star Wars bias within me. That being said, I adored this game. I loved it. It's a Game of the Year contender for me. I will do multiple playthroughs of this game. I still want to play it even after I finished it. I still want to play more. That's how good it was for me. That's how much I enjoyed it. But overall, this is a game that you need to tread with caution if you are interested in picking it up. If you can try it via EA Play as stated, try it. If not, you have to be mindful of what it is and whether or not it's worth it for you. But overall, I'm giving this game a 9.5 out of 10 with the asterisks. This is Veteran Gamer, and I hope to see you guys next time.